"Don't go in there, sir. Please. You can't go in there right now." The boy couldn't have been older than 9. He was standing at the side entrance of the Hargrove building, one thin arm stretched out, palm flat against the door like he alone could hold it shut. His jacket was 2 sizes too big. His sneakers were wet. Martin Ellery almost didn't stop. He'd been walking through that door every morning for 22 years. "Son," he said, slowing down, "I work here." "I know who you are, Mr. Ellery." The boy didn't move his hand. "That's why I'm telling you." Martin Ellery had built Ellery and Associates from a one-room office above a dry cleaner on 5th Street into one of the most respected corporate law firms in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was 63 years old. He had a reputation for patience, for precision, and for never making a decision before he had every relevant fact in front of him. He had 3 partners, 17 associates, 2 support staff who had been with him longer than some of his clients had been alive, and a daughter named Reese who called him every Sunday without fail. He was not a man who got rattled. But something about the boy stopped him cold. It wasn't the words. It wasn't even the outstretched hand. It was the eyes, flat and certain in a way that didn't belong on a child's face. The boy wasn't scared. He wasn't performing. He was simply standing there like a person who had made a decision and intended to see it through. Martin took a step back from the door. "What's your name?" he asked. "Tobias." "Tobias what?" "Tobias Webb." "How old are you, Tobias?" 10. He said it the way kids do when they want to make sure you understand they're not as young as they look. Martin glanced up at the building. 11 floors of glass and steel, his name on the directory, 6 meetings scheduled before noon. He looked back at the boy. "What is it I can't walk into?" Tobias lowered his hand slowly. He looked over his shoulder, then back at Martin. "The men who were here last night," he said. "They weren't cleaning people." Martin had seen the van himself. He'd worked late, until nearly 11, reviewing a contract for a client merger, and when he'd finally gone down to the parking deck, there had been a white maintenance van parked near the service entrance. "Commercial Cleaning Solutions," it said on the side. He hadn't thought anything of it. Buildings got cleaned. "What do you mean they weren't cleaning people?" he said. "I live in the building across the alley." Tobias pointed to a narrow brick building that faced the back of the Hargrove. 3rd floor. "My mom works nights. I was up late. I saw them go in at 8:30, and I saw them come out at 10, and they didn't bring anything out, but they brought things in." Martin felt something tighten at the back of his neck. "What kinds of things?" "Cases. Black ones, like the kind my uncle uses for his camera equipment." 3 of them, and a bag." Tobias paused. "They were arguing when they came out. One of them said they'd been in the wrong office the first time. The other one told him to shut up, that it didn't matter now. Wrong office," Martin repeated. "The light was on in your office, sir, on the 11th floor. I know which one it is because of the flag." Martin kept a small North Carolina state flag on the credenza by the window. It had been a gift from his father. "The light came on up there around 9:15, but you'd already left." Martin stood very still on the sidewalk. "Did you tell anyone?" he said. "I told my mom when she got home this morning. She said I was dreaming." Tobias said it without bitterness, just as a fact. "Then I saw you walking from the parking deck and I ran." Martin did not go inside. He told Tobias to stay where he was and walked back to his car. He sat in the front seat for a long moment, looking at his own hands on the steering wheel. The merger he'd been working on, the Glenfield acquisition, was the largest deal his firm had handled in a decade. $400 million. 2 corporations, a tangled web of subsidiaries, and somewhere inside that web, a dispute over intellectual property that had been quietly escalating for months. His client was Harlan Glenfield, a real estate developer turned tech investor who had built his fortune with the same methodical patience Martin respected in anyone. The opposing party was a firm called Brecken Capital, run by a man named Douglas Farr. Martin had never liked Douglas Farr. That wasn't unusual in his line of work. But the dislike had always carried something extra, something clinical and careful in the way Farr operated. 3 months ago, a junior associate at the firm had accidentally sent a summary document to the wrong email address. The recipient had been a dummy account, untraceable. The document had contained preliminary terms. At the time, Martin had written it off as a clerical error. His associate had been mortified. They'd increased their data security protocols and moved on. He was not moving on now. He called Reese first, not because she could help, but because she was the person he called when he needed to think out loud without being managed. She was 34. She ran her own landscape architecture firm, and she had inherited his habit of listening more than she spoke. "Dad," she said when he finished, "you need to call the police." "I know." "Then why are you calling me first?" "Because the police are going to ask me whether anything has been taken. And I don't know yet. And I need someone to walk through what that means with me before I walk into that conversation without my footing." Reese was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Walk me through it. They talked for 20 minutes. By the end of it, Martin had a clear idea of what he needed to do and in what order. He called the building's head of security, a man named Chester Pruitt, who had been working the Hargrove for 15 years and who took his job with the gravity of someone guarding a national archive. Chester met him in the parking deck. I need you to pull every camera feed from last night, Martin said. 8 p.m. onward. Every entrance, every elevator, every stairwell. Chester looked at him steadily. You want to tell me what this is about? Not until I know what we're dealing with. All right, Chester didn't push. That was why Martin trusted him. Give me 40 minutes. Martin walked back to the side entrance. Tobias was still there, sitting on the curb now, his hands tucked between his knees. He looked up when Martin approached. You didn't go in, the boy said. No. Martin sat down beside him on the curb, which was not something he did as a general rule, not in a suit, not on a Charlotte sidewalk at 7:45 in the morning. He sat down anyway. I want to ask you something, Tobias, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. The men you saw last night. Could you describe them? Tobias could. He described them with a precision that was almost startling. Heights, builds, the color of one man's jacket, the way the other had walked with a slight drag in his left foot, the make of the van, the first 3 digits of the license plate before the angle had shifted, and he'd lost the rest. He had been watching from his bedroom window with nothing else to do and a mind that noticed things. He told Martin all of it in the same flat, certain voice he'd used at the door. When he was done, Martin said, You're sure about the plate, FT4, Tobias said. Then I lost it. You didn't write any of this down? I didn't think anyone would listen. Martin looked at him for a moment. I'm listening, he said. Chester's footage confirmed most of what Tobias had described. The van appeared on the rear camera at 8:27 p.m. 2 men, both in gray coveralls with the Commercial Cleaning Solutions logo on the back, moved through the service entrance using a key card. On the elevator footage, they went to the 11th floor. They were in the building for 1 hour and 23 minutes. What they'd brought in, they'd brought out again. Whoever these men are, Chester said, scrolling through the footage. They had a valid keycard for that service entrance. That's not something you buy at a hardware store. That card was either stolen or copied from one of our staff. Martin stared at the frozen image on the screen. The taller of the 2 men had his face turned just slightly away from the camera. Deliberate, probably. The other had his head down. I want copies of everything, Martin said, and I want the name of every person who has access to a service key card for this building. He went upstairs to his office. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, looking at the room as if it were a space he'd never been inside before. His desk was exactly as he'd left it. The flag on the credenza, the stacked files, the framed photograph of Reese at 17, standing at the top of a hiking trail somewhere in the Blue Ridge, squinting into the sun. He didn't touch anything. He called his IT director instead. Her name was Priya Sandhu. She arrived within the hour, set up a diagnostic on his system, and within 20 minutes had found what she was looking for. Someone installed a passive monitoring device, she said, turning the underside of his keyboard toward him. It was small, no larger than a thumbnail drive, and would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. This captures keystrokes. Everything you type on this machine has been logged and transmitted since approximately 9:30 last night. The preliminary merger terms, the intellectual property filing strategy, the confidential communication from Harlan Glenfield's legal team that had arrived 2 days ago and that Martin had been drafting a response to for 3 days. All of it. He called his client before he called anyone else. Harlan Glenfield was 71 years old, a man who had grown up without much and built everything he had through a combination of genuine vision and an absolute refusal to be outmaneuvered. He listened to Martin without interrupting. When Martin finished, there was a long silence. How long has it been compromised? Harlan asked. We don't know yet. The device was installed last night, but this may not be the first intrusion. Another silence. Douglas Farr, Harlan said. It wasn't a question. I don't have proof of that yet, but that's where this points. That's where it points, Martin said. And that's exactly why I need to be careful about how I handle what happens next. If we move too fast and it falls apart in court, we've handed them a gift. If we sit on this, we risk more exposure. Harlan was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Time. 48 hours. Let me build the case before we take it anywhere. You have it. Those 48 hours were some of the longest of Martin's professional life. Priya worked with a cybersecurity firm to sweep every system in the office. Chester worked with the building's property management company to trace the keycard. Martin brought in a private investigator he'd worked with on 2 previous cases, a former federal agent named Guthrie who didn't say much and didn't need to. Martin briefed his 2 most senior partners, Karen Adeyemi and Paul Strickland, who both listened with the kind of stillness that meant they understood the full weight of what they were being told. Karen's first question was, "Is anyone inside the firm?" It was the question Martin had been carrying, since the moment Chester told him the keycard had to have come from someone with access. It sat in his chest like a stone. "I don't know yet," he said. "Until we do, we keep this to these four walls." The keycard turned out to belong to a member of the building's overnight maintenance staff, a man named Gary Fawcett who had worked at the Hargrove for 8 months, who had given 2 weeks' notice the previous Friday, and who had not come in for his last scheduled shift. His personnel file listed a home address that turned out to be a vacant lot in Concord. Gary Fawcett did not appear to exist before 18 months ago. Guthrie found the connection to Brecken Capital through a subcontractor, a security consulting firm that had done work for 3 of Brecken's portfolio companies over the past 4 years. The same firm had, according to a trail of shell payments that Guthrie traced with the patience of someone dismantling a watch, paid the man who called himself Gary Fawcett 6 weeks before he applied for the maintenance position at the Hargrove building. Martin sat with that information for a long time before he said anything. Then he picked up the phone and called the FBI field office in Charlotte. He did not tell them about Tobias Webb at first. He had a reason for that. He told them about the device, the footage, the keycard, and everything Guthrie had found. The agent he spoke to, a woman named Special Agent Diane Forsyth, was direct and competent, and she asked the right questions. She told him they would open a case. She told him not to touch anything in the office and not to discuss the details with anyone outside the firm. After she hung up, Martin sat in the conference room for a while with the door closed. He was thinking about a 10-year-old boy who had stood outside a door with his palm flat against it and told a 63-year-old lawyer that he couldn't go inside. He was thinking about what it had taken for that boy to do that, to run across an alley at 7:30 in the morning and stop a stranger in a suit and say what he had seen, knowing full well that adults didn't always listen, knowing that his own mother hadn't. Martin had told Tobias to go home after the conversation on the curb. He'd taken the boy's phone number, a cell phone his mother had given him for emergencies, and told him that he'd done the right thing and that Martin would take care of the rest. Tobias had nodded and gone, without asking what happened next, or whether he'd get any credit for it. Martin found that he kept coming back to that. The case broke open 17 days later. The FBI's digital forensics team recovered enough from the monitoring device and the payment trail to issue warrants. Douglas Farr was placed under investigation. The security consulting firm's offices were searched. The man who had been Gary Fawcett was apprehended at a bus station in Nashville under a third alias. Martin did not hear most of this from the FBI. He heard it from Diane Forsyth, who called him on a Thursday afternoon, and said, in the measured tone of someone who chose their words carefully, that the investigation was progressing in a direction that validated his initial report and that he should expect further contact in the coming weeks. He thanked her. He hung up. He sat for a moment in his office with the flag on the credenza and the photograph of Reese and the ordinary hum of the building around him. Then he called Harlan Glenfield to tell him that the deal was going to survive. Harlan listened. When Martin finished, he said, "Tell me one thing. How did you know? That morning, what made you stop and actually listen instead of just walking past?" Martin thought about that. "A boy told me not to go inside," he said. "And he had the kind of eyes that made you believe him." He drove to the brick building across the alley on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after it had all started. He didn't call ahead. He wasn't sure Tobias's mother would have let the boy come to the door if he had. He knocked. A woman in her mid-30s opened the door, tired eyes, scrubs, the particular wariness of someone who opened doors to strangers carefully. "Mrs. Webb?" Martin said. "My name is Martin Ellery. I'm a lawyer. I work in the building across the alley. I believe your son Tobias may have helped prevent something serious from happening to my firm several weeks ago. I wanted to come and tell you that in person." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and called into the apartment. Tobias appeared in the hallway behind her. He was wearing the same too-big jacket. He looked at Martin with those flat, certain eyes, and then, very slowly, the certainty shifted into something younger. "Did it work out?" he asked. "It worked out," Martin said. The boy let out a breath so long it seemed like he'd been holding it for 3 weeks. Martin had brought something, an envelope, which he held out to Mrs. Webb, not to Tobias. Inside was enough money to cover whatever Tobias needed for the next 2 school years. Books, supplies, a new laptop, something for the extracurricular thing he'd mentioned in passing on the curb. Baseball, Martin had gathered, though the season had already started. It was not a payment, and Martin had not framed it as one. He'd written a note that said simply, "Your son is a remarkable person. He trusted his instincts when most adults wouldn't have. I hope he always does." Mrs. Webb looked at the envelope for a long time without opening it. He told me he'd seen something, she said quietly. I told him he was dreaming. I know, Martin said. He told me that. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady. He didn't stop anyway. No, Martin said. He didn't. There was a moment walking back to his car that morning when Martin stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the 11th floor of the Hargrove building. The flag was in the window, small and still in the autumn light. He stood there for a while, thinking about all the mornings he had walked through that side entrance without looking up, without noticing what was around him, without considering that the world held people in it. People in wet sneakers and oversized jackets, people on third-floor windows watching alleys at night, who saw things that the rest of the world was moving too fast to catch. He thought about the years he'd spent in law, believing that the best protection was preparation, knowledge, process, that if you built your systems carefully enough, nothing could get through. He wasn't wrong about any of that. But Tobias Webb had not saved him with a system. He had saved him by standing in a doorway and deciding that what he knew mattered, and that saying so was worth the risk of not being believed. Martin got in his car. He had a Sunday call with Reese in the afternoon, and he already knew what story he was going to tell her. He drove out of the parking deck into the yellow October morning, and behind him the building stood quiet and ordinary in the light, the way it always had, the way it always would. Full, like all buildings, like all lives, of things happening just out of sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice.